Israeli activists are accusing the country's army of firing indiscriminately during last year's 7-week war in Gaza. A newly released report is based on the testimonials of more than 60 IDF soldiers who were directly involved.
The instructions are to shoot right away, be they armed or unarmed, no matter what.
The working assumption states anyone located in the areas the IDF took over is not considered a civilian.
If you shoot someone in Gaza, it's cool, no big deal.
Well, those were extracts from a report by a group called Breaking the Silence. Well, we spoke to its research director, Avihai Stoller, who's a former FDF soldier himself, I should say.
We had very clear rules of engagement, which stated that unless a suspect is carrying arms and is endangering you, you are not allowed to shoot. Once we approached the soldiers that participated in the last operation, they told us a very different story. The guiding principle in this operation was that once they enter the strip, if they see any person, they need to shoot immediately because the military dropped pamphlets warning the Palestinian civilians that they have to leave. And therefore, in the eyes of the military, whoever is still there in the neighborhoods has to be a militant. Most of the soldiers that came forward did not come, I guess, claiming that they were coming there, wanting to kill uninvolved civilians. Basically, they were lied by their commanders. It wasn't intentional in a lot of the cases, especially when I'm talking about the approach of the individual soldiers. It was indiscriminate, but that obviously is fundamentally different than being intentional.
The Israeli army says the activists have failed to provide any proof of their claims, although Israel has been previously accused by the UN and human rights groups of disregarding civilian lives during Operation Protective Edge. The Palestinians suffered major civilian casualties. Well, there's more images coming up showing the scale of the devastation inflicted on Gaza by Israeli airstrikes. The Palestinians have since formally joined the International Criminal Court in The Hague with the aim of prosecuting Israel over alleged war crimes. Well, let's talk about that more with Charles Shoebridge. He's a security analyst and former British Army officer as well. Hi, Charles. Good to see you there. Thanks for your time, as always. Let's talk about this report then. So, in the report, many IDF soldiers said they were told by their commanders to shoot at any threat, whether it's imminent or suspected. Is that how warfare should be conducted then?
I think the trouble is that in many cases it is how warfare actually is conducted. The fact is that war isn't pretty. This certainly is no defence of what the IDF carried out in the Gaza Strip. But when we think back to, for example, the way the United States military to a large degree behaved in the early days of Iraq, they also adopted what was known as a force protection stance. In other words, and this is one of the main points that comes through in this report that's been done into the Operation Protective Edge, that the safety of Israeli soldiers, in this case and American soldiers in places such as Fallujah before, was put well above, in terms of priority, the dangers that might be posed to any civilians in the area. And of course, those civilians can involve children, women and so on. The fact is, though, that this was not for Israel a war of national survival. This was supposed to be a counter-terrorist operation. And so, therefore, one would expect slightly different rules to apply, the ones that, in fact, in your package were just outlined in terms of don't fire unless there's an imminent threat, in other words, that you can see somebody has a weapon and so on. I think, as well as another aspect to be considered here, this isn't just about, of course, people or soldiers acting in their own defence. In other words, this could be a suicide bomber, therefore I'm going to open fire anyway. A very great proportion of the very large number of civilian casualties, and let's not forget the overwhelming majority, according to United Nations, of the 2,200 odd Palestinians who died in those 7 weeks were assessed to be civilians. The largest number of those were not killed in close combat with the Israeli army. They were killed by airstrikes, artillery and other heavy weapon fire at a distance at which the target could not possibly be said to be posing a threat to those soldiers who fired. So really we have to take this report, which is bad enough in itself, in a context of in many ways a much greater culpability in the terms of this very indiscriminate use of not close range weapons, as many of the soldiers on the ground were describing, but the heavy weapons which cause, of course, these great numbers of civilian casualties when they're used in this indiscriminate manner.
Well, Charles, let's go back to the mind frame of these soldiers if we can, try and understand it. Here's one quote from one of the soldiers then, I'll read it to you. So the rules of engagement are pretty identical. Anything inside the Gaza Strip is a threat. The area has to be sterilised. Now, as a former military officer yourself, can you imagine giving an order to sterilise one of the most populated places on Earth?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The context here is all important. If this was a battlefield and known as such, I mean, Israel would say it's a battlefield. But the point is, in the classic sense of a battlefield, in terms of that almost everybody there is going to be a combatant, then, of course, such rules may well apply. But nonetheless, still in the background, you've still got international humanitarian law applying. You've got the rules of war applying, so that civilians should be identified and harm to them avoided. And in all cases, the offensive weapon use, for example, and the military operation should be carried out in what's a proportionate manner. But I go back to this situation. The context here is of what Israel called a counter-terrorism operation. In other words, that the vast majority of people there were known not to be targets. And as you quite rightly say, the correct, if you like, geographical context here, the human context, is one of the most densely populated places on the planet, where simply because Israel dropped leaflets, sent text messages and so on a few hours before an area was going to be targeted, telling people it was going to be targeted, doesn't excuse what then happened in terms of bombardment and the actions that led to so many civilian deaths and injuries, simply because where in the Gaza Strip could these people go to? You can't move whole populations away from one area to another, plus other areas weren't told to be safe. The crossings were closed, people couldn't leave Gaza at the time. And so consequently, the Israelis to some degree, I think, accepted that anybody who was still remaining in these areas after this time was therefore going to be Hamas, and therefore a legitimate target in their mind. But I think on top of that, some of the report makes clear there are other factors at play in terms of the psychology that you've mentioned. And that is to some degree, and again the report mentions it itself, there's an attitude of, well, they're only Arabs, or that this is teaching them a lesson. And of course by that, we don't mean all Israeli soldiers concerned, of course, but some of them, and that may have permeated the command structure even.
I was going to move on to that, actually.
What happened to these people didn't really matter.
I was going to move on to that because I was going to say that some testimonials reveal that IDF was getting more radical in the sense that Arabs were targeted not as living beings. What could be the cause of this, do you think? That's what we want to know.
Well, we saw this even in our own media in the West during this campaign, this 7-week campaign, a massacre really of Palestinian people when you consider that Israel lost around 60 soldiers and around 6 or 7 civilians, but compared to 2,200 that were killed, including hundreds of children, that in our Western media, when, for example, an Israeli soldier was alleged to have been kidnapped, it turned out that he hadn't been kidnapped, he'd actually been killed in action. That dominated our news to a degree that the tens or hundreds of people that had died on that particular day didn't grab the headlines. And so there is this, if you like, seems to be a differential between the value of some lives and the value of others, those that are seen to be allied to us. And remember that during this campaign, the US and the UK, for example, totally backed the Israelis, although later there was some, if you like, concern about the disproportionality and the high death toll. But they absolutely backed what was going on, and of course the Americans even supplied these weaponry. I think there's a degree here to which as well there was an element of what might be said to be collective punishment. This isn't brought out in the report as such, but the context of it is that, of course, I think amongst some senior officers and amongst some commentators certainly is the view that if you punish the whole of Gaza, then of course those people would then put pressure on Hamas to stop firing their rockets, to make Hamas unpopular when or if elections then come round again. So in other words, it's putting political and, if you like, organisational pressure on Hamas by punishing the whole population. And there is some evidence for that. For example, Israel likes to say, along with its leaflets, that its famous knock on the door, where it was firing a dummy missile at a target, in some cases, many cases, a few moments before then destroying the building or the target with actual missiles. This was supposed to give people, and the Israelis say that the justification for those strikes was that those dummy strikes, the knock on the door as they called it, gave people a chance to leave. But of course, in many ways, that is damning evidence too, because if indeed it was a legitimate military target, in other words, there were people there, terrorists as they would call them, who they were trying to strike, you would not give such notice. So it's almost as if there's an acceptance on the one hand that these were civilian targets, including infrastructure targets that would punish the whole of Gaza, including power stations, for example, highways and so on. And on the other hand, trying to claim that this was somehow some kind of humanitarian gesture that meant that actually they were trying to spare civilian lives. The overwhelming thrust, if you like, of this report, which is anecdotal, and it is only 60 or so people who have given these, if you like, these interviews, it's very corroborative. It's very consistent with what we as observers, including military observers such as myself or former military observers, actually saw what was happening during that campaign, where civilian areas were being targeted, if not deliberately, and there is some evidence, I think in many cases, to suggest that was the case, but certainly in an indiscriminate fashion. And when you have such good intelligence systems as the Israelis have, including drones, satellite images and so on, in signals intelligence, when you have such good precision weaponry supplied largely by the United States, there really can be no excuse or understanding of the very high proportion of civilian deaths other than some degree either of recklessness or intent.
OK, Charles, we'll leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for your time. We do appreciate it. That's Charles Shoebridge, security analyst and former UK Army officer.